In January 2025, a lab most people outside China had never heard of released a reasoning model. It topped the international App Store charts. It briefly rattled US tech stocks. It generated more commentary about the AI race than anything since GPT-4. The model was DeepSeek R1. The lab was DeepSeek, a spin-off of a Chinese quant hedge fund. The training cost, per the company's own paper, was under $6 million. Western headlines reached for a frame quickly. China's AI Sputnik moment. The reference was to the Soviet satellite launch of 1957. That launch shocked Americans into questioning their assumed technological lead. The suggestion was that DeepSeek had done the same to Silicon Valley's assumptions about the frontier AI. This episode is going to sit with that claim and push on it from both sides. The Sputnik framing is doing a lot of work. It implies a gap closed, a lead overtaken, a policy failure revealed. Some of that holds up, some of it doesn't, and the parts that don't hold up are as analytically important as the parts that do. Welcome to the China Memo. We make unbiased observations on structural trends. I'm your host, born in China, trained in Western finance. First, a grounding. DeepSeek is owned and funded by a company called Highflyer. Highflyer is a Chinese quantitative hedge fund. That means a fund that uses algorithm and data models to trade financial markets, rather than human analysts making discretionary calls. It was co-founded in 2016 by Liang Wenfeng. He began trading during the 2008 financial crisis while still a student at Zhejiang University. Highflyer shifted to GPU-based deep learning for its trading systems around 2016. By 2021, most of its trading was AI-driven. Along the way, it built a large GPU cluster called Fireflyer. That cluster was assembled in 2019 at a cost of around 200 million yuan. In April 2023, Highflyer created an in-house AGI research lab. In July 2023, that lab was spun off as DeepSeek. Highflyer remained the principal backer. Liang Wenfeng runs both organizations. The structure matters. DeepSeek is not a startup hunting for venture capital. It is not a big tech subsidiary answering to a product roadmap. It is a research lab funded by a profitable hedge fund. Its founder has said publicly that his goal is not to lose money, nor to make huge profits, but to be at the frontier and promote the development of the entire ecosystem. The cash isn't the point, the frontier is. Liang recruited young PhD students from Peking University, Tsinghua, and similar institutions. They were chosen for academic output and competition results, not industry experience. Wired described the team as having strong papers and little industry baggage. These were the researchers who had not yet been shaped by the incentive structures of product companies. So what exactly happened in January 2025? DeepSeek released R1, a reasoning model. In other words, a system designed to work through multi-step problems, mathematics, logic, coding, not just producing fluent text. Reasoning models are currently one of the most competitive frontiers in AI development. R1 was trained on roughly 10,000 NVIDIA GPUs, according to the company's technical report. It reportedly beat OpenAI's R1 model on several math and reasoning benchmarks. The reported training cost was under $6 million. That figure drew immediate skepticism, also immediate attention, in roughly equal measure. The model was released open weight. In other words, the model weights were made publicly available under a permissive license. Think of model weights as the learned parameters of the system, the brain of the model. Anyone could download them, modify them, and run them on their own infrastructure. DeepSeek's earlier V3 model had been released the same way in December 2024. V3 was a 671 billion parameter system with a more efficient active compute design. The R1 app hit the top of US and international App Store rankings. US tech stocks sold off. The fear was straightforward. If a Chinese lab could deliver a near-frontier AI at this cost and this level of openness, the assumptions behind major American AI spending needed revision. Mark Anderson called DeepSeek one of the most amazing and impressive breakthroughs he had seen. The Sputnik framing spread within hours. It is worth taking seriously before examining where it overstates the case. The most important counter-argument is this. DeepSeek's achievement is real, but it does not mean what the Sputnik framing implies. Start with the hardware. DeepSeek trained R1 on NVIDIA GPUs. NVIDIA is an American company. The chips used, reportedly H800s and A100s, were obtained before the most stringent rounds of US export restrictions took effect. They are American-designed semiconductors. The efficiency innovations in DeepSeek's architecture are impressive, but they were built on foreign hardware. That hardware is becoming harder for Chinese labs to access under tightening export controls. Liang Wenfeng has said publicly that chip access still poses a bottleneck. That came from the founder of DeepSeek himself in a conversation with China's premier. The Sputnik satellite was Soviet-built. The DeepSeek model runs on American chips. That distinction is not trivial. Second, the $6 million training cost figure. This number circulated rapidly. It was widely cited as proof of an efficiency revolution. It may be directionally accurate, but it almost certainly does not capture the full cost of building R1. It does not include years of prior compute spent on earlier models, V2, V3, MOE architectures, that informed R1's design. It does not include the infrastructure cost of high flyers' GPU clusters. It does not include salaries, overhead, or failed experimental runs. The number is not fabricated, but it is the cost of one training run for one model at one point in the development process. It is not the total cost of producing a frontier reasoning model from scratch. Treating it as the latter is a misread. Third, open weight release is not the same as operational parity. DeepSeek publishing model weights is genuinely useful for researchers, for developers, for anyone studying the architecture. But OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google DeepMind are not primarily competing on model weights. They compete on inference infrastructure, safety tooling, enterprise integration, multimodal capability, and continuous updates. A point-in-time open-weight release is a research contribution. It is not a market position. The counter-argument holds real weight. DeepSeek is impressive, but the Sputnik frame overstates the strategic shift. Here is where it gets more complicated. The counter-argument, DeepSeek runs on US chips, the cost figure is incomplete, open weights aren't a market position, is largely accurate. But it leads some observers to a conclusion that also overstates the case. That conclusion is, DeepSeek demonstrates nothing important about the AI race. Export controls are working as intended. The gap remains safely wide. That conclusion is harder to defend. The relevant question about DeepSeek is not whether it has equaled the best American frontier models. The relevant question is what it tells you about the direction of the gap and how that direction changes on the constraint. DeepSeek used a mixture of experts' approach. This routes different parts of a problem to specialized submodels, rather than activating the full network for every query. That architectural choice emerged, in part, from working within hardware constraints. Think of it as designing a more fuel-efficient engine, not because you wanted to, but because the fuel supply was limited. MIT Technology Review argued explicitly that US chip restrictions have pushed Chinese labs toward efficiency and parameter-efficient architectures. Over time, this may make them less dependent on brute force compute, not more. That's the paradox of the sanctions as constraint argument. Constraint can drive a different kind of capability, not just slow development down. The New York Times framed R1 as nearly as powerful as its American counterparts, but significantly more efficient. If that efficiency advantage holds across future model generations, not just one release, it becomes more important as compute access grows more contested. There is also the organizational point. It is underappreciated in most coverage. The way DeepSeek is structured is unlike any of its Chinese predecessors. It is not a product of Baidu, Alibaba, or Tencent. Those labs were shaped by consumer product incentives and the corporate governance constraints. DeepSeek is not a state-owned enterprise working to a ministry brief. It is a research-first operation, backed by private hedge fund capital. Its founder has publicly declined to optimize for short-term profit. That structure produced something different. Whether it can sustain a frontier research position through years of hardware constraint and intensifying competition is an open question. But dismissing the template because the Sputnik framing is imprecise is a separate error. Before moving to the tracking markers, one more layer. Inside China, DeepSeek became something beyond a technical achievement. State media called R1 a model that matches the world's best at a fraction of the cost. Weibo hashtags trended. Liang Wenfeng had been essentially unknown outside quant finance circles. In domestic coverage, he was recast as a tech visionary, the kind of figure the national narrative around Innovation 2.0 had been waiting for. CNN noted that DeepSeek exclusively employs domestic talent. That detail was foregrounded in Chinese media coverage as pointedly as the model's benchmark scores. The subtext was explicit. This was not a success story that depended on foreign-trained engineers, foreign capital. It was framed as proof that China's own universities, its own researchers, and its own ecosystem could produce frontier AI. That framing serves a purpose, independent of whether it is technically precise. The domestic narrative around DeepSeek is a data point in its own right, separate from the model's benchmark performance. Now, 3 things worth tracking over the next few years. First, whether the efficiency advantage holds across model generations. R1 is one data point. The question is whether the architectural choices that produced its cost-performance profile scale to the next generation of reasoning models. If the next round of frontier models narrows the efficiency gap again, the DeepSeek episode looks more like a moment than a trend. If Chinese labs consistently deliver comparable reasoning at lower compute cost, the strategic picture is different. Second, the hardware trajectory. Liang has acknowledged the chip bottleneck. 3 paths are plausible for how Chinese AI labs respond over the next 2 to 3 years. The first path, continued workarounds through gray market access and stockpiling. Second one, a shift towards domestically designed chips, with Huawei's Ascend series as the primary near-term candidate. Third option, architectural adaptation that reduces dependence on the most advanced nodes. Which path is actually occurring and at what scale is the most important hardware layer signal to watch. Third, the organizational template. DeepSeek is not the only Chinese AI lab, but it may be pointing toward a new model. Hedge fund or private capital backed, research first, open weight, not optimized for near-term consumer revenue. If similar structures emerge with similar research mandates, that changes the competitive dynamics of Chinese AI development in ways that benchmark comparisons alone won't capture. The Sputnik framing for DeepSeek is too clean. The satellite metaphor implies something self-contained, Soviet engineering, Soviet resources, Soviet success. DeepSeek trained on American chips. Its reported cost figure is a training round number, not a full build number. Open weight release is a research posture, not a market position. But the counter-narrative is also too clean. That export controls are holding, that the gap is intact, that DeepSeek is interesting but not strategic. A research lab backed by a quantitative hedge fund, staffed by domestic PhDs, delivered a reasoning model that topped global app charts. It forced a revision of assumptions in Silicon Valley. It did so under hardware constraint. The architecture it used may be more durable under future constraint than the brute compute approach it was competing against. The honest red is this. The gap between Chinese and the US frontier AI labs narrowed in a way most forecasters did not anticipate. It's narrowed through a mechanism they also did not anticipate. Whether that narrowing continues, stalls, or reverses depends on hardware access, model generation cadence, and organizational sustainability, none of which the January 2025 release settled. The claim was too strong, the dismissal was too easy. The question is still open. This has been the China Memo. Thank you for listening. Before I go, nothing in this episode constitutes investment advice or a trade recommendation. The China Memo is based on publicly available sources. For financial decisions, please seek qualified independent advice.